Okay, if you want. I guess so. Okay, inshallah. So should I start right now or no? 5 more minutes. Inshallah, we'll start about 5 more minutes. Jazakumullah khair for your patience and away for waiting. In the meantime, I would ask all the brothers to please come close as possible, inshallah. Would really appreciate it. Make a little bit of effort and come closer, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. ठीक है अगर टाइम हुआ इंशाल्लाह ठीक है بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So I came here 2 times before this session that we're holding. I think one was 2 years ago, and the last one was a couple of months back. But they're all related to the same topic. In fact, if you weren't in those last 2 sessions, they will be maybe a little bit difficult for you to understand the framework or the context that I'm going to be speaking in today. So that's why, for those of us who weren't here in those last 2 sessions, or those who were here but have forgotten what we talked about, inshallah, I'll summarize it very quickly today. So the last 2 times I came, I mentioned the hadith of Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam, which is a very, very well-known, authentic hadith in all the hadith collections, including Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. It's considered the most fundamental of hadith because it summarizes the whole of the deen all in one small package. It's like the whole deen in a nutshell, basically. There's 2 specific prophecies that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam cited in that hadith. One of the prophecies was the subject of my first session, and the second one was the subject of my second session. So the first one was related to the discovery of oil, the change of paradigm in the Arabian Peninsula, where the poor Bedouins will become filthy rich. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was indicating uh, that because of the discovery of oil, there will be an immense amount of wealth poured into the Arabian Peninsula, and people will become so rich um, that they will be building skyscrapers and competing with each other in building skyscrapers. But there's another point that I derive from that, which was the essence of that specific prophecy. And that was that the discovery of oil was not only about the change in the Arabian Peninsula, economically speaking, but it was also about the modern world, because our modern world is all resting on the discovery of oil. So I talked about how most of the things that we see around us that are that make up the modern world that we live in is all made out of and manufactured by oil. From your paints to your carpets to your construction material of any kind, all your synthetic materials, all your plastics, everything. And so what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was directly saying was about the Arabian Peninsula, but what he was alluding to was also the modern world. That was the first session. The second session, we talked about the collapse of the social hierarchy. And what I mean by hierarchy is that there will be no respect left. If I bring it any closer, I'll be swallowing it. It's better if we increase the sensitivity instead of bringing it so close that I end up taking it in like a lollipop, right? So in the second session, what I talked about was about the collapse of the social hierarchy. What I meant by social hierarchy was that the concept of respect for people based on certain criteria will completely diminish in modern society. And what I mean by that is the concept of age, for example, as a means of respecting others will be gone. So respect for your parents, for example, because of their age, because of their status, that will disappear. Respect for elders in general, not necessarily just your parents, but elders in general, regardless of whether they're Muslims or non-Muslims. In Islam, there is a general concept that if someone is older than you, regardless of who they are, because of the experience and the wisdom that comes with age, they deserve a certain level of respect. They don't have to be Muslim. They don't have to be of a certain, background. Also, for example, respect for people who have more knowledge than us, right? So if there's somebody who has more knowledge than I do, then I will show them respect. For example, my teacher, right? Because he is my teacher, but also because he has more knowledge than me. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam talked about the collapse of that type of hierarchy as well, where the student relationship is not really a student-teacher relationship anymore in terms of religion. So we see nowadays that everybody is considered an alim. Anybody can become an alim just by going on Google. Or he studies a few ahadith and he becomes very knowledgeable, and he's equivalent to the person who spent his whole life studying the deen. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually mentions this when he says, قُلْ هَلْ يَسْتَوِي الَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ وَالَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ. Those people who know and those people who do not know cannot be the same, right? Which means that the people who don't know have to respect those who have more knowledge than them. But when the collapse comes in the hierarchy, there will be no difference. Anybody and everybody knows, even though one of them devoted their whole life to knowledge and the other one just learned from here and there, secondhand, and not devoting their whole time to it. So we see that happening in the modern day as well. The only type of respect that exists in general in general. I don't mean that it's completely disappeared, but it's diminished to a certain extent that you can clearly see in the public, and you can clearly see it that it's very, very common. It's commonplace and it's prevalent nowadays. That both these two signs that I mentioned are prevalent and rampant in our modern society. Now, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam mentioned these two specific signs in the hadith of Jibreel because any prophecy that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam mentioned thereafter have to be understood in the context of these two specific prophecies. They can be considered like the mother of all prophecies, right? So when we study these few hadith, and there's many thousands of prophecies that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has mentioned, but in order for us to understand them properly, we need to understand the hadith of Jibreel first, the prophecies in the hadith of Jibreel, and then in the framework of those two hadith, which I just mentioned briefly, we can understand these hadith better. So now we need to understand these hadith in light of our time, not in light of the time when the social hierarchy still existed, in the time when the discovery of oil wasn't made and the modern world still didn't exist. It was still the pre-modern era. So let's start with our first prophecy. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in a hadith of Sunan al-Tirmidhi, he said, "Ma dhi'bani ja'i'ani ursila fi ghanamin bi afsada laha min hirs al-mar'i ala al-mal wa sharafi lidini." He said, two hungry wolves, if they're led upon a herd of goat and sheep, what they would do to that herd of goat and sheep will not be as bad as what a human being's love for wealth and his love for status will do to his deen. In other words, there's two types of diseases within us, spiritual diseases, that have to be controlled and constantly monitored all the time to prevent them from destroying us from within. In fact, from destroying our connection with Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If these two diseases are not removed and they're not monitored constantly, then the likelihood is that they will destroy a person's deen, their connection with Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The time that we live in right now is a time where these two problems are incubated. What I mean by incubated is that they're promoted, they're fed, they're breeded, they're increased as much as possible. And I'm going to explain with examples so you understand it better. And I think the students, the younger ones, will understand it a lot better, right? Nowadays, a lot of people are on YouTube, right? YouTube is a good place for spreading the deen because you can come across to a much larger audience all across the world. But it also increases the disease of love of the self. How? Because you get more subscribers, you get more likes, you get more people who make positive comments, give you positive reviews, and what does that do? It destroys your connection with Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam because it makes you feel good about yourself. Now, feeling good about yourself is not a bad thing, but what it can feed into is arrogance and what we call vanity, ujub. And this is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying, is that when your vanity increases and when your arrogance increases, then it will eventually destroy your relationship with Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam because you become your own God. You think something of yourself. And so this in itself is a big fitna in our times. Because in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he saw a Sahabi in a situation where his vanity may be increasing, or he was in a situation where his arrogance could increase, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would immediately notify them of that situation and tell them to pull out. And I'll give you an example of this so we understand this better. There is one Sahabi, his name is Miqdad ibn Aswad radiyallahu anhu. He asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to give him a position in government, meaning that make me a governor of this place, something of that sort. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam accepted, and he appointed him to some place, but he said, you have to come back within a certain period of time and update me about the situation and how things are going over there. So he went, and he came back after the period was over, and he came straight to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is mentioned in Hayatul Sahaba as well. He came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he says, so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam asks him, how was your running of the government and your dealings with the people? He said, Ya Rasulullah, alhamdulillah, I left in the state that people were pleased with me, and I enacted the Quran and the Sunnah. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked him, how do you feel about yourself? He said, Ya Rasulullah, I feel like I was on a tower and I was looking down upon the people. What he meant to say was, I felt like I was getting arrogant, that I was feeling something big about myself. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, would you like me to send you back, or would you like to stay? He said, Ya Rasulullah, please don't send me back. Don't send me back. Because he knew that if he was to go back and this situation continued, it would slowly what? Feed his vanity, it would feed the disease inside, and it would increase him in his, it would not necessarily increase, but at least create arrogance inside of him, and he knew that would destroy his relationship with Allah and his Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Sahaba Ridwanullah alayhim ajmain were always in a state of self-evaluation. That's why he was able to notify Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam of what he was feeling inside, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was also testing him, right? Nowadays, the way elections are done and the way campaigns are run, people are self-elected. I can do the job, hire me, right? Elect me, and I'll do it. And I'll do this, and I'll do that, and I'll do this, and I'm like that. You hear this stuff all the time. That's how the system is run now, right? If you look at the Khilafah of Abu Bakr Siddiq and what he was able to accomplish, the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab, radiallahu anhu, and what he was able to accomplish, you need to remember one thing before that, and that is that both of them were forced into their position. They didn't want it. Neither did Abu Bakr Siddiq want his position, nor did Umar ibn Khattab want his position as Khalifatul Muslimin. They didn't want to take it because of the fear of these two things destroying their deen, right? So that was one time, and look at the time that we live in now, where we have all these different platforms like social media outlets that help promote and increase and feed these two problems that could potentially destroy our deen. Some people will say, and there's a lot of them that will say, you know what, it wouldn't happen to me. This wouldn't happen to me. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us a dua. He said, make a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is the dua that I taught one brother when he came to me and he said, I want to start a YouTube channel because I want to spread the deen. I said to him, you know, whatever you decide, that's up to you. I won't tell you one way or another, but I will teach you the dua that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught the Sahaba Ridwanullah alayhim ajmain and the Ummah. He said, Allahumma la takilni ila nafsi tarfat ayn. Oh Allah, do not turn me over to myself for even a blink of an eye. Don't put yourself in a situation where you're turned over to yourself for even a blink of an eye, because it'll eventually, what? Cause problems for you. And people who are arrogant and people who have vanity issues are people who are always disliked and repulsing other people around them, because nobody likes a person who is arrogant. Nobody likes a person who has vanity issues. They're by nature, by character, by attitude, repulsive in their nature. We run away from such people. People like humble people. People get attracted to humility, right? In any case, this is one hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam related to a time that will come where we will live in an environment where these type of diseases are promoted and incubated and increased, so that a person becomes less a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and more of a shaitan, right? And there's one hadith related to what I just mentioned, inshallah. We'll talk about that later. This is also a reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that if anybody ever comes to you and praises you, what should you do? Very famous hadith like this, that when somebody comes and he praises you, make sure that you throw dirt in their face. Why? Now, we don't know if he meant that literally, most likely figuratively, but the idea was that when you come and praise a brother, you're helping him destroy his deen because he feels good about himself. That could possibly create arrogance inside of him, vanity inside of him, and make him forgetful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we face such situations where somebody's praising us and we feel that there's that, possibility of me turning away from Allah because I'm thinking about my own greatness and how, what a great person I am. I did this and this person said this about me. And I remember just recently I went to Turkey, I think last year, and then a year before that as well. And I rented a car from a specific place, and I put a review of that specific company because I knew that there's a lot of foreigners that come into Turkey. So I thought this review would be helpful for them to understand, because I had that same issue. I was looking for reviews to find out, I want to rent a car, what's the best place to go and where's the best service. So I thought this review would be helpful for others. So eventually that review was very helpful to a lot of people because I got 1,000 reviews on it, right? But Google made a point of reminding me every few days, you just got another review. And people are saying this about you, and people are saying that about you. And this one gave you a thumbs up, right? Like that constant feeding into like, you're good, you're good. Their idea behind it is to show you that you're doing so good so that you give more reviews because that helps them, right? It helps the people, of course, but it also helps Google, right? So everybody's looking out for their own benefit. And you're looking out for, oh my goodness, see how great I am, how much benefit I'm giving to the people. And you obviously contribute by giving more reviews and getting more feedback on it, and that increases more of it. And so if you're not constantly monitoring your inner state, the possibility or the potential exists of a person becoming very, very distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and forgetful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us all. Here's a riwayah by Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. He said to someone, and he's narrating a prophecy. Now the Sahaba ridwanullahi majma'in, if they narrated something without mentioning Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it was related to ilmul ghaib, meaning the unseen, it was definitely coming from whom? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the Sahaba could not have known these things on their own. So this is, although it's not narrated by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's being narrated by a Sahabi. We know it's coming from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he's saying, and he's mentioning this point in Kufa, because that's where he settled down, in Kufa, thousands of miles away, or at least 1,000 miles away from Medina Munawwara, in a gathering of tabi'een and his students. He says, إِنَّكَ فِي زَمَانٍ كَثِيرٍ فُقَهَاؤُهُ قَلِيلٍ قُرَّاؤُهُ. You are living in a time where the fuqaha are many. Who are fuqaha? Anybody know who fuqaha is? Faqih. What does faqih mean? Huh? Somebody who studies fiqh, right? We often say a jurist, somebody who studied Islamic jurisprudence, right? And in the traditional Islamic system, we have a special science called fiqh and usul fiqh that we study. And every person who wants to become a scholar has to study that science in order for them to graduate the Islamic studies program. So fuqaha, but this is not exactly what he means by fuqaha. He means something broader than that, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. He said, you are living in a time where the fuqaha, meaning the people of knowledge who have deep understanding, a profound understanding of the Quran and Sunnah, are many, right? قَلِيلٍ قُرَّاؤُهُ. There are very, very few qurra. What does qurra mean? Reciters of Quran Kareem, right? So the qurra are few, but the fuqaha are many. So there are more people who understand Quran, but much less people who are actually great qurra or reciters of Quran. That doesn't mean that there weren't qurra in that time. What it means is that their focus was more on understanding the Quran and Sunnah and how to act upon it and practice upon it. And there was less focus on just recitation of Quran Kareem itself. And with tajweed, with pronunciation. تُحْفَظُ فِيهِ حُدُودُ الْقُرْآنِ. The boundaries of the Quran are being preserved. In other words, the laws of the Quran are being preserved in practice. People make sure that they don't disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They don't violate the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قَلِيلٍ مَنْ يَسْأَلُ. There will be very few people asking. كَثِيرٌ مَنْ يُعْطِي. And many who will be giving. In other words, we live in a time where people are generous. And those who don't have, don't go and beg it. They just have tawakkul on Allah and are pleased with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them, but don't ask from the people, they only ask from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so their connection with Allah is strong. يُطِيلُونَ فِيهِ الصَّلَاةَ. Their salah is very long, meaning we live in a time where the salah is very long. يُقَصِّرُونَ فِيهِ الْخُطْبَةِ. But the talks, the speeches are very short. The khutbahs are short. The salah is very long. And you know, if you read the history books, when you look at the Sahaba Ridwanullahi Majmain, like Abu Bakr Siddiq and Umar ibn Khattab during their khilafas, when they used to lead the salawat, like they used to pray really long surahs in their Fajr, Zuhur, Asr, Maghrib, Isha. In fact, when Umar ibn Khattab, Amir al-Mu'mineen radiyallahu anhu, was assassinated, he was reciting Surah Yusuf. And it's often mentioned about the Abu Bakr Siddiq radiyallahu anhu that when he used to recite Quran, he used to start the recitation in Fajr at Ghalas time and finish at Isfar time. Isfar time is right before the sun rises, and Ghalas is when it's completely dark and dawn has just started. So imagine how long that was. So if your timing for Fajr starts at, for example, 5:30 and it ends at 7, so he's starting at like 5:35 and he's finishing right before, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes before 7. So it's an hour-long salah. And he's just reciting maybe the whole of Surah Yusuf or maybe a large portion of Surah Baqarah. And they used to recite nice and slow. And this was every single day, right? If the Imam recited like that now, we already get only 3 people for Fajr, right? Then it'll be in the minus. Even the Imam won't be there. Right? So يطيلون فيه الصلاة ويقصرون فيه الخطبة. يبدون فيه أعمالهم قبل هوائهم. They have more, they look at their a'mal and spreading of the good deeds before they look at their fulfilling of their desires. وَسَيَأْتِي عَلَى النَّاسِ زَمَانٌ. But there will become a time where things will be completely inverted, opposite of what they are like now. وَسَيَأْتِي عَلَى النَّاسِ زَمَانٌ كَثِيرٌ قُرَّاءُهُم. There will be many qurra, many reciters of Quran. And if you go online nowadays and you want to listen to a recitation of Quran Kareem, you have hundreds to choose from, right? Hundreds of qurra to choose from. And so many beautiful voices out there, so many different qurra out there. You can listen to one or the other. Now, this is not to say that recitation of Quran is bad, na'udhu billah. What the ishara or the allusion that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is making in this is something bigger, which we're going to talk about. Right now, I just want to do translation. كَثِيرٌ قُرَّاؤُهُمْ قَلِيلٌ فُقَهَاؤُهُمْ. The fuqaha, the people who understand the deen and who study the deen, will be fewer. So that there's many qurra, but there's very few fuqaha. تحفظ فيه حروف القرآن. The huruf of Quran are being preserved. وتضيع حدوده. But the actual laws of Islam and the boundaries of Islam and the boundaries that are laid out in Quran are all being trespassed and violated. Meaning people are not following Quran, but they're reciting Quran a lot. But there was a time when people were reciting, professional, quote unquote, reciters of Quran were less, but people were following the Quran properly. قَلِيلٌ مَنْ يُعْطِي وَكَثِيرٌ مَنْ يَسْأَلُ. There will be a lot of people asking, but very few people giving. Even though the time that Abdullah bin Masud radiallahu anhu lived in was a time where there was less wealth amongst the Muslims, and now we live in a time where there's more wealth. But they were more generous then, and we're more stingy now. So it's not about how much you have, it's about where your heart is, right? The more tawakkul you have on Allah, more reliance you have on Allah, the more generous you will be in giving because you know everything is coming from Allah. يُطِيلُونَ فِيهِ الْخُطْبَةَ وَيُقَصِّرُونَ فِيهِ الصَّلَاةَ. The khutbahs will be very long. Speeches and talks. And you hear how many talks are? But when you actually, the talks are very long, the speeches are very long, the khutbat are very long, the bayans are very long. But the actual salah that's prayed is kept very short. يُقَصِّرُونَ فِيهِ الصَّلَاةِ. Even though salah is fard, and khutbah is not even fard, it's not even wajib. But people will spend more time on listening to talks and listening to speeches, and the person who's giving the speech is giving long talks like here, right? You're like, speak for yourself, right? وَيُقَصِّرُونَ فِيهِ الصَّلَاةَ. But the salah itself is very short. يُبَدُّونَ أَهْوَاهُمْ قَبْلَ أَعْمَالِهِمْ. And they're following their desires more than they're following the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, a very interesting comparison that Abdullah bin Masud radiallahu anhu is making between his time and our time. The Qurra are few in that time, the Fuqaha are many, right? And our time, the Qurra are many, the Fuqaha are very few. There's a couple of things we need to understand. When a person has an understanding in the deen, fiqh, right? It's not something that you can hear or that's tangible, right? So if you see a person walking and he's a faqih, will you know he's a faqih? Is there any way you can know he's a faqih? No. But if a person is a qari or amongst the qurra, it's easy to figure out if he's a qari because when he's leading the salah, you know he recites really good. And so Quran will be a means of self-promotion. Quran will be a way of presenting ourselves. Right? So what he's talking about is the same thing that I mentioned earlier, is that when the hearts get corrupted and the disease of vanity and that kind of stuff spreads, then you have more people who are spending more time investing and devoting more time to those sciences that bring what? Self-promotion. That broadcast ourselves more to others than those sciences that don't. Everybody understand what I'm saying? Everybody understand my point? Right? Abdullah bin Masud was from a time where people didn't look at how good your recitation was. They weren't superficial. They looked at how your a'mal was. What was your connection with Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Nowadays, if you want to become an imam of a masjid, they don't really care. In general, we're talking about Muslim communities all across this country. Nobody cares how good you know the rulings of the Quran and Sunnah. What they want to make sure is how good a speech you give and how good your recitation of Quran Kareem is. If you recite Quran very well, you can get a job instantaneously almost. Recite very well and you speak very well, you can get a job instantly as an imam. Even though you don't know the alif ba of Quran and Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You ask a person, How many fara'id are there in salah? How many fara'id are there of wudu? What are the basic compulsory or basic components of salah? What are the basic components of wudu? And he doesn't know. But since his recitation is good, and since his speech is good, he's an eloquent speaker, he'll get the job right away. And this kind of epitomizes what we're talking about, is that we are more focused on the superficial things than the things that really, really matter, right? And this is a big ikhtilaf between Imam Shafi and Imam Hanifa when it comes to their criteria for who can be appointed as an imam, right? Which is a separate subject which can be discussed on another time. But the point is that there was a lot more focus on understanding the Quran and Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then, and focusing on those sciences that were all about connecting with Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, making sure we understand it properly, so we do amal properly. Now we don't care so much about amal as long as superficially it looks like you know your stuff. Meaning, if he recites Quran, he must know the deen very well. Right? That's number one. Number two, the second point that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is alluding to here is that fiqh itself, the understanding of deen, the faqh, comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in a hadith of Sahih Bukhari, "Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fid din." Whoever Allah wishes khair for, He grants them an understanding in the deen. Abdullah bin Mas'ud is a good example of that. He was a faqih of his time, one of the most knowledgeable and the greatest fuqaha of his time, to the extent that other Sahaba ridwanullahi majma'in, when they didn't understand a certain issue and how to understand it in light of Quran Sunnah, they came to Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. He was a faqih of his time. Okay, and if you look at the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, it embodies much of the fiqh of Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, because Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu settled down in Kufa, and that was where Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi was from. And Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi's teacher was Hamad bin Abi Sulaiman. His teacher was Ibrahim Nakhai. Ibrahim Nakhai's teacher was Alqama and Aswad, and Alqama and Aswad were both the students of Imam Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. So indirectly, Imam Abu Hanifa is a student of Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. And same way goes for Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik. They're all learning from teachers whose teachers go back to the great fuqaha among the Sahaba. But there are not a whole lot of them, because fiqh doesn't come from earning it, from working hard in it. It's something that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So fiqh is not something you work hard to get. You can't do your PhD in Islamic studies and you'll become a faqih. It's something that Allah gives to you. Just like, and the example I like to give to understand this better, is just like prophethood. Can you earn prophethood? This is, by the way, an issue of creed. This is an issue of Islamic belief. We believe as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is that you cannot earn prophethood. What does that mean by earning prophethood? That if I do so many devotions, that I can eventually become a prophet. No, prophethood comes only from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He appoints by His free will whoever He wants to be a prophet. It's not that a person does so many good deeds and therefore now he is a perfect candidate for prophethood. Right? The same thing goes for fuqaha and mujtahidun. Fiqh comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so those people who are granted fiqh are the people who excel in understanding the masail related to the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if the fuqaha are few, that means that there's less people being chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have fiqh, to have understanding in the deen. Which means Allah slowly, the number of people with understanding of the deen is slowly decreasing, because there's less people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is choosing for this task. But it also has a lot to do with the fact that there's less people going out in the path of Allah to learn the deen. And this is pointed out in another prophecy, which is not directly related to this, but I'll share it with you. One of the prophecies that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us about is the shortage of imams. A time will come where there will be less imams. So he says, سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول يأتي على الناس زمان, a time will come upon the people, يقومون ساعة, they'll stand up, looking around, لا يجدون إماما يصلي بهم, they will not find an imam to lead them in the salah. What does that mean? You say, we have imam here. Sheikh Umar is here. Sheikh Umar is not from your community. He's imported. Right? So you couldn't find an imam from here, so you brought an imam from outside, didn't you? And that's what most of the communities are doing, because they can't find an imam from their local place. Why can't they find an imam from their localities? Because people are not going out to learn the deen. Parents are not sending their children to learn the deen. They're sending their children to become doctors and engineers and whatever else. So we have a shortage of imams. And therefore we have to import the imam from outside. Right? He may be from another area. He may be from a totally different country. And that creates another set of problems. What's the set of problem that we create when we have imams from overseas? There's a problem that I see happening a lot, is that when there's imam coming from overseas, the issues that are created because of difference of culture, the culture gap, right? It creates a big issue for kids from a community who are learning from that teacher who is from a totally different part of the world. They don't understand him, he doesn't understand them. But he's here now and he knows his Quran, so he's going to teach it to the students, and the community will hire him because they don't have anybody amongst themselves, and he's cheap too. He just needs enough to survive, so they pay him a little bit, and it works good for both. But in reality, nobody's getting anything good out of it. Yes, they learn a little bit of Quran, which is good, but the purpose is not to learn Quran. The purpose is to learn the deen. Just because you learn how to recite Quran and you go to maktab and you learn a little bit of recitation, remember, the recitation is not the main purpose. The main purpose of deen is to follow the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It means conveying the feeling of the deen. And if there's a culture gap, then you can't convey that feeling of the deen, like love for Allah, love for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, why we should follow deen. Because there's a lack of communication, the teacher can't convey that feeling to the students, and the students can't convey that feeling, what they feel about what they're facing in the schools to their teacher, because the teacher's not from this part of the world, so he doesn't understand what they're talking about. He just considers them so disrespectful that he wants them out of their face as soon as he can. Time's up, out. So this is just one type of problem, but there's a whole set of problems that are created when we bring somebody from outside, right? So the shortage of imam is indicating a bigger problem where we're not devoting, we're giving money up for the deen, but we're not giving our children up for the deen, right? And when you have, and our communities are only growing now, and you have maybe hundreds of kids in a community, and not even one of them is going out in the path of Allah to learn the deen and to come back and to serve the community, that means that you're going to have a shortage of imams, and that's exactly the big issue that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is referring to here, right? So where are you going to get fuqaha and people who are trying to understand the deen when there's nobody being sent out to learn the deen in the first place? That's a problem in itself, right? So as I mentioned, fiqh in itself is what? Is not a science that you learn and you study. It's something that comes from what we call ilm ladunni. It's something that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives it to whom He wills. And so that time will come when there will be, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will choose less and less people. Therefore, now you're looking for an imam who can tell you about modern contemporary issues that people are facing, but there's not enough fuqaha to explain it and to break it down in light of Quran and Sunnah so they can explain it to you. So everybody is making up their own ideas. And this is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam talked about in another hadith of Sahih Bukhari. He said, إن الله لا يقبض العلم انتزاعا ينتزعه من العباد ولكن يقبضه بقبض العلماء. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to lift knowledge from the ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how will He take it away? Not by taking away the books. He'll take it away by taking away the ulama, the scholars. He'll remove scholars from the communities. You won't find scholars anymore. Now, there could be different reasons why there's no more scholars, but they will decrease and diminish in number. So you can't find fuqaha, you can't find scholars anymore. Then what happens? Then there will be people who will be juhalan. The word used in the hadith is juhalan. Ignorant people. Fasu'ilu. They will be asked questions, but they don't know because they're ignorant themselves, but they don't want to appear ignorant to people. So they will answer according to their lack of knowledge, right? According to their lack of knowledge. So they'll come up with their own opinions about what they think the Quran and Sunnah says about an issue, but it's fadallu, they are deviated, wa adallu, and they're deviating the people from the straight path as well. So not having fuqaha, not having scholars means more deviation. And that's also what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is referring to in this hadith, that when there's less fuqaha, there's many qurra. Having many qurra is not a bad thing, but having less fuqaha is very dangerous because that means that there's going to be more deviation. In fact, alhamdulillah, at least in your community, you even have an imam. There's many communities who make huge masajid, beautiful masajid, no imam, no scholar. So then where are they getting their deen from? Anybody can go up and lead. Anybody can go up and do Jummah. There's nobody who's actually dedicated his life to studying the knowledge of the deen, who's being appointed for the responsibility of making sure people stay on the straight path. Sometimes they will hire an imam, but that's another problem by itself. And this is going to take us to another prophecy that I wanted to share with you. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, and he's talking about Bani Israel. This is a hadith of Sunnah Tirmidhi, and it's narrated also by Abdullah bin Mas'ud. He said, "Inna awwala ma dakhala naqsu ala Bani Israel." The first time in Bani Israel, referring to the Jewish people, when they became deficient in their deen, was when the first signs of deficiency in their deen was when kana rajulu yalqa rajula, a man would meet another man. Okay, fayaqulu, and he would say, ya hada, O person, ittaqillah, fear Allah, wada'a ma tasna, and don't do what you're doing. This is wrong. In other words, he's doing what we call enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. Amr bil ma'ruf nahy anil munkar. Right? Don't do this. This is wrong. فَإِنَّهُ لَا يَحِلُّ لَكَ. This is not halal. You can't do this. ثُمَّ يَلْقَاهُ مِنَ الْغَدْ. But he's from the same community, and they meet in the masjid. They meet often in by the fact that they're from the same community. So they meet often. So he meets him the next day. فَلَا يَمْنَعُ ذَلِكَ. But he doesn't stop him this time. What does he do? أَن يَكُونَ أَكِيلَهُ وَشَرِيبَهُ. Now he becomes his partner. They eat together, they drink together, وَقَيْدَهُ, and they sit together. In other words, they're like friends. So he thinks that he's fulfilled his responsibility by telling him once, and after that, I've done my job. Now I don't got anything to worry about. Whereas in reality, this is not a job, this is a responsibility, and you have to take it to heart that if somebody is doing something wrong, you have to stop him, and if you can't stop him, then you need to take action by saying to yourself that I have to stay away from this person because this person has turned against Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So a time will come when people will not take deen seriously. They'll take it as like a job. I told him, he didn't listen, Now it's not my responsibility. I did whatever I had to do. And I've heard people say that about their children. When their children are doing something wrong, he said, I told him, he didn't listen. I'm not responsible anymore. But in reality, the deen is a responsibility. It's not a job. It's not like I've done this. I had to fulfill these guidelines. I fulfilled the guidelines. Now I don't have to do it anymore. You have to do it to the very end. There are some people, and these are amongst parents, when we talk to them about, making sure that your children pray salah, and they said, yeah, I tell them, but they don't listen. And that means that they fulfill the responsibility and it's done now. But the reality is the responsibility never ends. In fact, the hadith specifically mentions that when they're 7-year-old, then you have to start. And when they're 10-year-old, then you have to admonish them if they don't can pray anymore. That means from the age of 7 all the way to the age of 10, you're continuously what? Warning them, reminding them. That's 3 years of continuous reminder over and over. That means you can't take this as a job. You have to take this as a personal responsibility. You have to take the deen personally, not professionally. I'm a Muslim, therefore, as a Muslim, I have to do this. And once I've said it once, I've said it twice, I've done my job. No, you're not getting paid for this. This is a responsibility. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving you iman, and He giving you knowledge. You know that this is wrong. You have to stop it to the best possible way you can. In the best possible way you can. But this person, according to this hadith, what is he doing? He stops him once, and thereafter, he's best friends with him. Like they're hanging out together, they're chilling out together. So he's not taking the matter of deen seriously. He's not taking the matter of deen seriously. When this happens, فَلَمَّا فَعَلُوا ذَلِكَ, when this happened in Bani Israel, ضَرَبَ اللَّهُ قُلُوبَ بَعْضِهِمْ بِبَعْضٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turned them against each other. In other words, it created divisions. Allah created divisions amongst them. Rift between them. So the lack of unity we see in our ummah, what's the cause behind it? Is that we don't take the deen seriously. When we see something wrong, we stop it, but we continue to hold relationships with that person as if it's not a big deal. Yet, if that same person had looked at my wife in the wrong way, I don't want to see his face again. That dirty person, right? But when it came to the deen and that person did something wrong, it's okay. It's not a big deal. He's still my friend, right? Now we're in a situation now where you have people who come to me, I'm sure to the other imams and leaders of different communities who say, I have a friend, he's Muslim, but he's homosexual. If your friend and then he's homosexual, like, I don't understand. And this is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is talking about. Yes, you have to lay it out to him. Listen, he's Muslim, he's homosexual is a problem in itself. Right? It's almost like you can disobey and obey Allah at the same time. You say, I'm obedient to Allah, and yet you're disobeying Him. Now we need to remember one very clear distinction here before I go on, and that is that somebody who commits a homosexual act or any major sin doesn't take one outside of the folds of Islam. It doesn't. It makes a person a big sinner and disobedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but doesn't take you out of the folds of Islam. What's happening now, the new phenomenon that we're seeing is that people are doing major sins and justifying it. That's what's dangerous. That basically means your iman is now gone because you're justifying the fulfillment of your desire. That is kufr. And that is not tolerable in Islam. We don't tolerate it. Now, what does it mean by something that we tolerate or are intolerant of? So you have the evangelical Christians who have a very hard take on these type of issues and things like abortion, where they will just get the sledgehammer out and ready to smash heads. That's not the way we deal with issues when we say we're intolerant. It basically means you have a person who claims to be a Muslim and he does this, and you stop him. You say, this is wrong. You explain it to him in the best way you can, but he justifies action. He says there's nothing wrong with it or whatever. Then you need to let go. In other words, you have to make your friendships and your relationships in your life based on Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We've heard many, many stories like Abdullah bin Mughaffar radiallahu anhu, who stopped his nephew from doing something wrong, and it was even something big. And he said to him that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that this is not okay. You shouldn't be doing this. And the nephew, for whatever reason, continued doing it. And he said to him that I don't want to see your face again. I told you Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that this is wrong. You still continue to do it. I don't want anything to do with you anymore. And he cut off his relationship with him based on just that. That's how strict the Sahaba were. And here on the other end, right, the situation is completely like we want to keep friendship with him at all costs, even if it means compromising our own relationship with Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have to be very careful about that because that's a big fitna in itself. If a person is willing to compromise his own relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam for the sake of people, for the sake of image, for whatever other reason, then you're caught up in a big time fitna. This is considered maftoon. Such a person is called maftoon. He's in fitna himself. Even though he does his ibadat, he's there in time for salawat and he's pious, and mashallah, he looks very pious, but he has this problem. He has a big problem in his deen. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is giving an example of Bani Israel to show us that this is going to happen amongst us as well. Be very careful. In another hadith, very similar to this, he's specifically talking about scholars doing this. Scholars will tell you, don't do this, and then you'll still continue to do it, and they'll still be fine with you. And this is what I wanted to go back to, which is why I brought this hadith in the first place, is that we have certain masajid that will hire imams, which is better than not hiring anybody, to help guide them and keep them on the Quran Sunnah. But they don't hire them for keeping them on the Quran Sunnah. They hire them so that they can do what they quote unquote, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. Basically, they pay them very well to keep them silent. And if you get $125,000 per year, who's not going to keep their mouth shut? Right? They're going to keep their mouth shut. In fact, without naming names, I'm going to give you a very specific example. So I had a person, a board member of one of the masajid, call me, and he said, we're receiving, they didn't have an imam in the masjid, so they were interviewing different people. And there's this one person, he's presented his, what do they call it? Resume. Yeah, his resume for doing imamat. And he was in another place previously. He said, what do you think of him? Because he knew I knew that person. I said, did you interview him yet? He said, we did. I said, I won't answer your question. I want you to do a background check of the previous masjid where he was before he's come to you for the resume. So he called me a few days later and he said, I got my answer, we're good. So the story of this person in the previous masjid is that in that specific masjid, they were doing everything that should not be done in any masjid. And the imam was okay with it because he was getting paid a lot of money. A lot of money. In fact, he was asking this community, they were offering him $65,000. He was asking for $110,000 a year, not including benefits and medical insurance and all, which basically means imamat for him is just what we call a job, not a responsibility. not a personal responsibility that I have to make sure this is my position. I'm a scholar, I'm an imam. I have to make sure people stay on the Quran and Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What we call taqwa. This is taqwa. Fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah is going to ask me on the day of judgment that I was a leader of the community. When you saw them doing something wrong, you didn't stop them because you were making this much money. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to hang him for that. He's going to be in trouble for that. Kullukum mas'ulun wa kullukum mas'ulun an ra'iyatihi, right? Kullukum ra'in wa kullukum mas'ulun ra'iyatihi. Every single one of you is a caretaker, and you will be asked about those people who are under your care. So if you're imam of the masjid, the community is your responsibility. So you will be asked as the imam about your community, and when you saw them doing something wrong, why didn't you guide them? Why didn't you show them the way and stop them? And that's a great big challenge for ulama and scholars in this part of the world, in fact, all across the world, but more in this part of the world where there's a constant struggle going on, where there are some communities, not all communities, but many communities who want to go on one path, and they're looking for the imam that will help them stay on that path. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying that time comes, if you're a true scholar and you have taqwa of Allah and you know you will be asked and reckoned with about your community on the day of judgment, then you need to pull back and either say, I resign because I can't handle this. This is not right. I have to put Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam first. I can't compromise my deen for your sake. Either you straighten up, or I'm going to have to find myself another place to go. And that's why a person like me prefers to study and learn and teach in a madrasa, because then I don't have to deal with the community so much. It's an easy way out, right? That's why I like this position better, right? But it's scary. That's why it's scary. Now you will say, "Oh, okay, but then who's going to guide?" Well, that's not my problem so much. It is a problem, but there's also we also need to have scholars, right? And people who are producing those scholars. So we have to have people in madrasas as well. So both things are necessary, right? In any case, if you look at these prophecies, right, of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you realize that there's a lot of warnings, not just for the ulama and the scholars and the imams, but also for people who are caretakers in the homes, the parents, making sure that their children are staying on the right path, and not just like saying, I did my job and I told them once, or I told them and they didn't listen, and then you just let them go. Like, nobody lets their children go into the fire. Why are you letting your children just, disobey Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam so openly, and you're not doing anything about it? And now we send them to college, university, where all that stuff is out in the open, and they're taking it all in, right? Which brings me to my next subject. We went today to Browns Island, just wanted to check it out, and it turned out there was a big LGBTQ protest or demonstration or festival or something going on there. And that was the end of my meeting there. I just turned back, headed back home. Sheikh was with me. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, there's a prophecy regarding that. No, we didn't go with that intention, so don't hold them accountable for it. وَمِنْهَا, a time will come, نِكَاحُ الرَّجُلِ الرَّجُلَ, a man will marry a man. وَذَلِكَ مِمَّا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ, and these are among the things that Allah has declared haram. His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam has declared haram. We are seeing more people, quote unquote, coming out as Muslims and also declaring themselves to be, you know what, right? And this is a big problem for one reason. Why? What's that one reason? What's that one reason? You see, the thing is that it's bad enough that a person is claiming to be Muslim, and at the same time he's claiming to be from this community. But what is even worse than that is when you get used to it, because you hear it so often. So this is just the beginning of it, right? Now, as it becomes more and more common, and it becomes more, quote unquote, naturalized, right? You're going to see it happening more and more. So if people don't stand up and speak up and voice their dissent, right, it's just going to keep on increasing, and people can become desensitized to it. And when you become desensitized, that's a part of a compromise of your deen. This is a compromise of your deen. When you get used to this stuff, you know, in the 80s, like those of us who are from the 80s, for us, this was like a major shock, because even though it was there, but it was like considered bad in most of society. People didn't like it. And even, we're not talking about Muslim communities, even non-Muslims didn't like it, right? Now, everybody's in the game. Well, it looks like anybody's in the game, because there's those who are not, who are against it, aren't speaking up. So it seems like everybody's into it. Everybody's with it. Everybody's endorsing it, because nobody's speaking up. So if you can't speak up, the least you can do is communicate what the deen says about this. For the imam, it's his responsibility to communicate what the deen says about this. For parents to communicate this with their children. And if you see people in the community who are of that like, you have to leave them, keep them outside the doors. We don't allow this in our area. Do whatever you want out there. I can't stop you. But inside this, we're going to keep it exactly like the way we want. And you have to have it as a part of your constitution of your masjid, so you can preserve your children of the next generation. Because if you're going to have, you're not going to stop these things, and you're not going to raise your voice against it. Tomorrow, 15 years, 25 years, 30 years down the line, when our older generation is all gone and you have the new generation in, and they're okay with this because you never stopped it, or never spoke up against it, or never voiced your disapproval of it, your children will think it's okay, and they'll bring all of it into the masjid. They'll become the new board members, and it'll become a part of the new version of Islam. And you have, not many, but have some masajid that are more agreeable to the idea of it now. And I'm talking about masajid where the imam is, quote unquote, a traditional scholar. Na'udhu billahi min dhalik. I was shocked to hear this. That there was one masjid where any time the topic of this community came up, and he would say, we're not going to talk about this issue. Why are you not going to talk about this issue? This is the time to talk about this issue. You need to bring it up. This is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying, is that when this happened in Bani Israel, they just said it once and then they were done. Then they were just okay with it all. You can't be commending these things or just endorsing these things by completely ignoring it or overlooking like it doesn't exist. You have to recognize the problem, first of all, and then you have to challenge it openly, publicly, in the best way you can. If it's as a parent to your children, if it's imam to your community, if it's board members, making sure that it's included in the constitution so that we can preserve deen for the next generation. This is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is talking about. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, for as long as the dhikr of Allah is alive, لا تقوم الساعة, hadith of Sahih Muslim, لا تقوم الساعة حتى يقال Allah, Allah. For as long as there are people in this world, he's talking about believers who do Allah, Allah, the Qiyamah cannot come. So we are the people who are going to stop the Qiyamah from coming, because we're going to hold back the shar, the evil from coming in. But if we're staying quiet and we're in another way, or we're just staying silent, that's another way of agreeing to it, of endorsing it. It's like tacit approval. You can't stay quiet. You have to speak up. You have to communicate. If you're going to live in this part of the world, you're going to have to communicate it. You're going to have to voice it. Otherwise, we will be held accountable on the Day of Judgment. My children know about this. And they have to know about this, because if I don't tell them and they don't hear it from us, tomorrow they don't know what to think about this issue. And it's so prevalent that, remember, the more prevalent something is, the more pressure is on you to accept it. the sweeter it looks, because everybody's doing it. People say that often. What do they say? Oh, everybody's doing it. Why are you stopping me? What does that mean? That if the majority says something, it must be right. We don't believe that concept in Quran Sunnah. We don't believe that criteria. That if the majority says something, it's always right. If you follow most of the world, you'll be misguided. Allah saying in Quran Kareem. That's why we have Quran and Sunnah as a form of guidance, because whether it's majority for or against, we always have Quran and Sunnah to guide us on the straight path. We don't use majority or minority as a means of guidance or misguidance. So we have to set our criteria straight. So this is what Rasulullah ﷺ is referring to in the hadith. Here's the last hadith I want to share with you, and we'll end with this inshallah. This is narrated by Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma by Rasulullah ﷺ. Rasulullah ﷺ is talking about a group of people that will rise in this ummah who will have أَلْسِنَتُهُمْ أَحْلَى مِنَ الْعَسَلِ. Their tongues will be sweeter than honey. What does that mean? Tongue sweeter than honey. What does that mean? They're good speakers. Very impressive. These are the things we look at, right? We judge a scholar by how good he speaks, not by how much knowledge he has, by how much taqwa he has. We don't look at taqwa anymore. We look at he's a good speaker, and he has a course going on, and he has this institute, and so many people are benefiting, and people are learning Arabic, and people are learning the deen. But how do you know he's a scholar? Have you even checked his credentials? His background? Where did he study from? Who did he study from? Right? I don't know. He gives really good speeches. He has a YouTube channel. He has millions of followers. Again, we're going back to that what? Majority issue. Everybody's saying it, so it must be good. A big problem. So, أَلْسِنَتُهُمْ أَحْلَى مِنَ الْعَسَلِ. They will have tongues that are sweeter than honey. وَقُلُوبُهُمْ أَمَرُّ مِنَ الصَّبْرِ. But their hearts are more bitter than aloe, which is a type of a food that is consumed. Sabr, which is a very bitter thing that comes out of a plant, like a sap from a plant. So Rasulullah ﷺ says their hearts are more bitter, but their tongues are very sweet, so they appear very good. And what he means is that they don't have deen in their hearts. They're just using the eloquence of their speech to acquire dunya, money, to acquire fame, status. لَأُتِيحَنَّهُمْ فِتْنَةً تَدَعُ الْحَلِيمَ مِنْهُمْ حِيرَانًا. I will make them a source. This is Allah speaking in Hadith Qudsi. I will make them a fitna that will leave even the people of wisdom of this ummah hayran, like shocked that a person who's of this level of eloquence and he's misguiding so many people, but people love him because they think that he's a person of deen. So you have people who have hearts like wolves, but they appear like so impressive, because that's the type of society we will live in. A superficial society where we base things off of superficial criteria, that if this person speaks well, he must be good. Even though he's not even a faqih, he doesn't have fiqh, he doesn't have understanding. Right? The scholars that I know, the teachers that I know, many of them don't give good speeches, but their knowledge is profound. They wouldn't last on YouTube. Nobody would listen to them because they're not entertaining, but they have knowledge. And you have those who don't have much knowledge, but they know how to make it, oversimplify it, and make it look so nice that they could present it like a dish with gold on it. And everybody's like willing to pay so much money for it too. I know there was one of them that he charged $5 for entry into a masjid to listen to his talk, and 1,000 people came, and it was only for one night. Intensive, right? Good money. And then we had students coming to our madrasa, and they said, we want to become like that person. Why? Because he's famous. Why? Because he makes good money. So even kids' intentions are being corrupted because of that, because they have become our new role models. But those are not scholars, because scholars are not judged or distinguished by the amount of money they make, or by how eloquent their speech is, or by their status. They're known by their knowledge and the sacrifice they make. If you look at the life of Imam Bukhari, rahmatullah alayhi, subhanallah, right? This is a simple example of Imam Bukhari, rahmatullah alayhi's life. Imam Bukhari, rahmatullah alayhi, would teach knowledge to anybody who came to his door. And he had regular gatherings in his local masjid. Okay? So the governor of Bukhara wanted him to teach him some hadith. So he asked Imam Bukhari to come to the palace to teach him hadith. Imam Bukhari says, no way. You want knowledge? You come to my doorstep and I'll teach you knowledge. You come to me 5 a.m., 3 a.m., 3 p.m., any time of the day, I'm willing to teach knowledge, but you have to come to me to seek knowledge. I don't care who you are. He was putting himself in very big danger, because we didn't live in a time where you could hire a lawyer if somebody of power was to get on your case. Right? He could just call you, frame you, next thing you know, beheaded. Right? So he's putting himself in danger. So the governor, all the imams who were paid for by the government, he got them on his side, and they issued a fatwa against Imam Bukhari under some pretext. Oh, he said this, and made a big issue out of it and declared a fatwa against him, just to destroy his reputation with the people. But did it destroy his reputation? Subhanallah. Everybody knows about Imam Bukhari. Nobody knows about those big muftis, whoever those scholars were, who tried to soil his name. Right? And nobody knows about that governor and what happened to him later on. But these were people who are not willing to sell their deen for the sake of the dunya. He stood strong, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saw his respect and taqwa, and his willing to stand up for respect for the knowledge of the deen, that I'm not going to come to your door just because you're a governor of this city. No, you got to come to me just like everybody else. Otherwise, I'm not going to sell my knowledge for the sake of reputation or power or to get status. He said, okay. And by the way, it's a very lengthy story, but he said, okay, if you don't want to teach me, I'll send the princes over, and then you could teach. You can teach it to the princes, my sons. He said, I'm not going to teach your sons. You have to send your sons too. He said, okay, if you can't come, at least you can do is hold a separate session for them. He said, I don't hold separate sessions for anybody. Nobody's special in ilm. Nobody's special in ilm. That, you know what, because you're this and that, therefore I'm going to hold a separate session for you. You're going to be just like everybody else. I hold my gathering in the masjid, you come to the masjid. I hold in my house, you sit with everybody else and you learn the knowledge of the deen. That's the only way you're going to gain knowledge of the deen. We know about Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, great sahabi of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. From which tribe? Quraysh. From which clan? Banu Hashim. The noblest of all tribes, the noblest of all clans, all of Arabia. He used to sit at people's doorsteps of the Ansar Sahaba, who are not of the same level of nobility, to learn the knowledge of deen. And that's how Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu became what? Hibrul Ummah, the sage of the Ummah. Because he didn't look at status, he didn't look at name and fame. He looked at, I will put my honor down, my name down, seek the knowledge of the deen, and look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what level of knowledge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted it. So scholarship comes from taqwa, from sacrifice, from struggle, not from eloquence of speech. These are basic things that we have forgotten, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is reminding us in the prophecies. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all the tawfiq to stay away from the fitnas. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all the tawfiq to revive the sunnahs of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to stay on the path of taqwa, to stay on the path of deen, to stay on the path of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to stay connected with Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. اللهم إنا نسألك حبك وحب من يحبك والعمل الذي يبلغنا حبك. اللهم إنا نسألك من خير ما سألك منه نبيك وحبيبك سيدنا محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم، ونعوذ بك من شر ما استعاذك منه نبيك وحبيبك سيدنا محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم، وأنت المستعان وعليك البلاغ ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خير، أحسن الجزاء. There you go.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله